True horror story. Room 412 is scary. In the fall of 2012, San Francisco was covered in the yellow of maple trees, and the sea breeze blew gently, bringing a chilly breeze. Emily, a recent architecture graduate, came to the city to attend a professional conference. In order to save money, she chose to rent a room at the St. Clair Hotel, a famous old building located in the city's historic district. This hotel has existed for more than a century, possessing classic beauty and many rumors about wandering ghosts. Emily is a practical person, not much of a believer in the supernatural, but the stories about the St. Clair Hotel still made her curious. After checking into room 412, a small room on the top floor, Emily felt a little tired after the long flight. The room had a single bed, an old desk, and a window overlooking the cobblestone streets below. "It's okay," Emily told herself, trying to shake off the slight chill she felt as soon as she entered the room. Emily put down her luggage and began to pack her things. As she opened the closet, she noticed a long crack in the faded wooden door. When she touched it, she felt a cold breeze, even though there was no wind. "That's strange," Emily muttered. She took out her phone, thinking to call the front desk to ask about the crack, but then decided against it, thinking it was just a small detail that shouldn't be a concern. She decided to take a shower to relax. While waiting for the water to heat up, Emily looked at the large mirror hanging on the wall. The mirror looked very old. The wooden frame was worm-eaten. Suddenly, for a moment, Emily felt as if a shadow had passed behind her in the mirror. But when she turned around, there was no one there. "It must be the reflection of the light," she told herself, but the feeling of unease still smoldered in her heart. After taking a shower, Emily sat at her desk, turned on her computer to review the conference schedule. Suddenly, she heard a very small whisper, as if someone was talking right next to her ear. "Go, go," the high-pitched, sorrowful voice rang out, making Emily's hair stand on end. She quickly raised her head, looked around the room, but saw no one. The window was still closed. No one else was in the room. "I must be imagining things." Emily tried to calm herself, but her heart was still pounding non-stop. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked down at the street below. The yellow streetlights cast shadows of people passing by, but nothing unusual. When Emily returned to her desk, she suddenly noticed an old diary lying under her pile of documents. She was sure she had never seen it before. Curiously, Emily picked up the diary. The cover of the diary was frayed. The pages inside were yellowed. She carefully opened the first page and began to read. The neatly handwritten notes told of the life of a woman named Clara, who had stayed in this room in the 1930s. Clara wrote of her loneliness, despair, and the strange things she had experienced in this room. As she read, Emily felt a cold breeze blow past her, making her shiver. The words on the page seemed to blur, and she heard a familiar whisper. Don't read." Emily quickly closed the diary, a feeling of dread beginning to take over her mind. She decided to call a friend, Sarah, who was also in San Francisco for a conference. After telling Sarah about the strange things she had experienced, Sarah seemed quite worried. "Emily, maybe you should change rooms. That hotel is famous for being haunted," Sarah said over the phone. Emily hesitated for a moment and then said, "I'm not sure. Maybe I'm just too sensitive. But I'll be careful." After hanging up, Emily felt a little more secure having someone to share with, but the uneasiness was still there. She looked towards the diary lying on the table, a strange urge making her want to continue reading the remaining pages. Emily couldn't resist her curiosity. So she opened the diary again. The last pages were written in a shaky, scribbled handwriting. Clara told of a dark figure that often appeared in the room, strange noises at night, and the feeling of being watched. The last page had only one line, "He's here," and then stopped abruptly. At that moment, Emily's room door slowly opened, even though she was sure she had locked it. A cold wind blew in, carrying a musty smell and a strange, bloody scent. Emily looked at the door in horror. The darkness was all around, but she clearly felt a cold presence standing there, silently observing her. A soft sigh sounded, like a greeting from the other world. The door to room 412 slowly opened, a black gap like a wide open mouth, swallowing all the remaining faint light in the room. Emily stood there, her heart frozen in her chest. Her breath caught. The cold air from the hallway blew into her face, carrying a strong musty smell, mixed with a stench, as horrible as dried blood. The darkness outside the hallway seemed to thicken, covering all sounds, leaving only the sound of Emily's heart pounding in her ears. She felt an invisible presence standing right at the doorway. Something cold, heavy, watching her every move. Who's there? Emily called softly, her voice lost in the silence. Only the soft whistling of the wind outside the window answered her, like a cold mockery. Then, a very soft sigh, choked like a sob, echoed from the darkness, making Emily shiver to the bone. Emily hurriedly stepped back, her eyes not leaving the half-open door. Her foot tripped over the armchair next to the desk, causing her to fall onto the cold floor. A small bang sounded, breaking the terrifying silence. She crawled back to the corner of the room, her back pressed against the damp wall, trying to shrink like a small animal hiding from a predator. Extreme fear suffocated her heart, making it hard for her to breathe. "No, it's not real, it's just a nightmare," she muttered, trying to calm herself, but the fishy smell still rushed straight into her nose. And the cold, creepy feeling still didn't go away. Emily trembled as she fumbled for her phone in her pocket, her fingers tapping the screen haphazardly. The call was connected. The long, lingering ringing sound made her even more anxious. Sarah, I'm so scared." Emily's voice choked, tears welling up. "Emily, what happened? Are you okay?" Sarah's worried, panicked voice rang out from the other end of the line. Emily sobbed and quickly told Sarah about the door opening by itself, about the fishy smell and the feeling that someone was in the room. There was silence on the other end of the line for a moment. Then Sarah said in a determined voice, "Emily, listen to me. You go down to the reception immediately and change rooms. I'll be there right now. Wait for you in the lobby." Emily nodded vigorously, tears streaming down her face. I understand. Hurry up." Sarah. She hung up the phone, trying to stand up, but her legs were shaking like autumn leaves. Not listening to her control, Emily tiptoed out of room 412. The fourth-floor hallway was eerily quiet. Only her light footsteps echoed in the quiet space. The weak yellow light fell on the faded red carpeted floor, creating long, winding shadows on the wall like ghostly fingers trying to hold her back. She walked quickly towards the elevator at the end of the hallway, not daring to look to either side, afraid that she would see something terrible. When she reached the reception hall, she saw Sarah already waiting there, her face filled with worry. "Emily, are you okay? Your face is pale." Sarah hugged her, her voice full of worry. Emily shook her head, still shaking like a leaf. I don't want to stay in that room for another second," she said, her voice choked. Tears welling up again. The night receptionist, a middle-aged man with a cold, emotionless face, listened to Emily's account of what had happened with indifference. "Ma'am, we're sorry for your bad experience, but we haven't received any reports of this before," he said, his tone a little doubtful, even annoyed. "Perhaps you're just a little tired from the long trip. We'll change you to another room downstairs." His indifferent attitude made Emily feel both disappointed and helpless, as if no one believed what she had been through. Finally, after some begging and Sarah's intervention, Emily was transferred to room 216 on the second floor. This room seemed brighter and warmer than room 412, but Emily still could not forget the cold and scary feeling in that room. She did not dare to sleep, sitting with her back against the headboard, pulling the blanket over herself, her eyes not leaving the door. Sarah had returned to her hotel to rest after making sure Emily was better. But Emily still felt lonely and a vague uneasiness lingered in her mind. Suddenly, in the middle of the quiet night, she heard a very small sobbing sound coming from the hallway outside. The cry of a child. It sounded so miserable, desperate and lonely that it was heartbreaking. Emily tiptoed out of the room, looking around the quiet hallway, the dim night light shining on the floor, creating strange dark streaks. The crying seemed to come from the end of the hallway, where an old wooden door was closed, covered in dust from time. Emily slowly walked towards the door at the end of the hallway, her heart pounding as if it was about to jump out of her chest. Every step she took on the thick carpet echoed softly in the quiet space. She gently touched the cold brass doorknob, then gently turned it. The door made a soft, creepy creak sound and slowly opened. Before Emily's eyes was a dark room. Not a single bit of light coming in. The crying still echoed somewhere in the darkness. Clearer, closer. Is anyone there? Emily called softly, her voice trembling, trying to stay calm. Suddenly, a candle placed on a small table next to the window automatically ignited. The small flame swaying violently, casting strange, distorted shadows on the wall. In the flickering candlelight, Emily saw a small figure sitting huddled in the corner of the room. It was a little girl, about 7 to 8 years old, wearing an old, dirty white dress, a pale, thin face, big round eyes filled with tears looking up at Emily. Who are you?" Emily asked, her voice full of worry and sympathy. The little girl did not answer, just sobbed, tears rolling down her pale face. Then slowly raised her small hand, pointing to an old rag doll lying on the floor, right next to the rickety single bed. Emily gently approached the doll, picked it up. The rag doll was worn, dirty, one eye was torn, the cotton thread inside was exposed. When Emily's finger touched the doll, a stream of cold, painful memories suddenly rushed into her mind. She saw the image of a little girl playing happily and innocently in this room, her clear laughter echoing throughout the space. Then the image suddenly disappeared, replaced by the scene of the little girl being scolded and pushed to the floor by someone. Finally, Emily saw the image of the little girl lying motionless on the floor, surrounded by a pool of bright red blood, stained on the faded carpet. Emily was horrified and dropped the doll. A light thud sound echoed in the quiet night. She realized this was not just a room haunted by a soul, but a place to hold the pain and resentment of many souls. The little girl's cry rang out again, this time clearer, more sorrowful, like an urgent cry for help, a plea to be freed from this hell on earth. Emily felt a heavy responsibility weighing on her shoulders. She could not ignore the little soul crying for help. She had to find out what really happened in this room, and help the imprisoned souls, to give them eternal peace. Emily trembled as she hugged the rag doll tightly to her chest. The cold feeling from it seemed to penetrate deep into her flesh. The horrifying images that had just appeared in her mind were still clear. Like a haunting slow-motion film, the little girl's sobs echoed in the room. No longer a soft sob, but a painful, heart-wrenching sob. What's wrong? Do you want to talk to me? Emily asked softly, her voice trembling, trying to appear gentle and comforting. The little girl's figure was still sitting huddled in the corner of the room, her big, tear-filled eyes looking at Emily. But she didn't say anything, just cried silently, clear tears rolling down her pale face. Then, suddenly, the doll in Emily's hand shook slightly. A gentle but distinct vibration, and a weak, fragile voice like a breeze rang out in her head. It hurts, it hurts. Emily was startled, almost dropping the doll. She looked around the room, her eyes examining every corner. But there was only her and the little girl's figure sitting huddled in the dark corner. You can talk? Are you talking to me? Emily asked, her voice filled with surprise and a little doubt. This time, the voice rang out more clearly in her head, like a whisper from very close. Can you help me? The tiny voice, carrying an extreme despair that made Emily's heart clench. Emily was determined to find out the truth about the history of room 216 and the ghost girl named Lily. The next morning, after a sleepless night, tossing and turning with chaotic thoughts, she went down to the reception hall, hoping to find more information from the longtime workers here. The morning receptionist, a kind middle-aged woman with neatly tied hair and warm eyes named Mrs. Miller, looked at Emily with concern and a little worry. You look tired, girl, Mrs. Miller said, her voice soft and sympathetic. Emily hesitantly told Mrs. Miller about her strange experiences last night, about the babies crying, about the shadow and the feeling that someone was in the room. Mrs. Miller listened attentively, her gentle expression gradually becoming serious, her eyes shining with a faint sadness. Oh my gosh, you're in room 216? It's one of the most famous rooms here. Mrs. Miller sighed, her voice sad. A lot of bad things have happened there. A little girl named Lily died in that room in the 1950s. It's said that her spirit still wanders there, looking for help, for release. Mrs. Miller paused for a moment, her eyes looking far away as if recalling a sad memory. Her family was very sad. They stayed at this hotel for a long time, and Lily was a very lovely girl. It's unfortunate, her voice choked, not continuing. Hearing Mrs. Miller's words, Emily felt a deep sympathy, a boundless pity for the little soul imprisoned in that room. She asked Mrs. Miller if she knew anything more about Lily and what happened to her. Mrs. Miller said that Lily was the daughter of a wealthy family who came from far away, and they stayed at the hotel for a long time to rest. One night, Lily fell seriously ill, had a high fever, and died in room 216. Her sudden departure left an inconsolable pain for the family. Since then, many people, both guests and hotel staff, have heard her crying in the quiet of the night, and sometimes even seen the shadowy figure of a child wandering in the hallway. Returning to room 216, Emily held Lily's rag doll, feeling a strange connection, an indescribable harmony with this little soul. Suddenly, a loud bang rang out. The door of the room slammed shut, so loud that Emily jumped. The room was plunged into darkness, with only a faint light coming through the window. And then, she heard the familiar whisper in her head again. Lily's voice, this time more urgent. You. Find the other doll. The hidden doll, in the wall. Emily quickly turned on the flashlight on her phone. The weak light swept around the room, and she noticed a large crack running along the wall at the end of the bed, where it seemed like there had been a door or some kind of passage that had been plastered over. Emily decided to check the wall with the crack. She tapped it lightly with her hand, and heard a hollow sound echoing behind the plaster. She tried to push the wall with her shoulder, but it remained still. Emily looked more closely. She noticed that a few bricks seemed different from the rest. She gently shook one brick with her hand, and it wobbled. With a little dexterity, she was able to pull the brick out, revealing a dark void. Emily timidly turned the flashlight inside, and she saw a small, narrow room with no windows. The air inside was stuffy and cold to the point of being terrifying. A musty, old smell and a fishy, unpleasant smell rushed straight into her nose, just like the smell she had smelled in room 412 last night. Emily felt a strong, irresistible urge to open this plastered door. She quickly ran down to the reception hall and asked Mrs. Miller to borrow a small hammer and a pair of pliers. Mrs. Miller looked at her with concern and suspicion. What are you going to do? Emily? You shouldn't destroy hotel property on your own. Emily hurriedly explained what she had discovered and her urge. Mrs. Miller sighed after hearing that. Her eyes flashed with fear. But in the end she still gave her the necessary tools, not forgetting to tell her to be careful. Back in room 216, Emily carefully used the pliers and hammer to break the tiles around the crack. After a few minutes of struggling, the bricks were finally removed, revealing an old wooden door, locked with a rusty padlock. The door made an eerie creaking sound as Emily used pliers to break the lock. Emily took the flashlight and entered the secret room. The room was small and narrow, with no windows, and the air was stuffy and cold like a tomb. On the floor covered with a thick layer of dust, she saw an old wooden chair with a broken leg, a small, rickety table, and in the corner of the room, she saw an old wooden chest locked with a rusty brass lock. Emily approached the chest, trying to open it with her hands, but to no avail. She used a hammer and pliers to break the lock again. This time the lock seemed easier. When the lid of the chest was opened, a strong stench rushed into Emily's nose, making her almost vomit. She was horrified to see that inside the chest was another doll, larger than the one Lily was holding, but its face was painted with scary fake blood. Its eyes were wide open, and its body had many cuts, as if it had been stabbed many times. At the same time, Emily felt a cold, evil presence envelop the room. A hoarse, creepy voice rang out right behind her. You shouldn't be so curious. Secrets should be buried. Emily jerked back, her heart stopping. The flashlight's shaky beam shone into the darkness, and she saw a tall, shadowy figure standing right behind her, blocking the exit. His face was hidden in the darkness, but Emily could feel a hatred, a terrible malice radiating from him, like a dark energy that was enveloping the entire room. He slowly raised his hand, and Emily saw a shiny, sharp knife in his hand, the faint moonlight shining through the crack in the ceiling hitting the blade, creating a cold streak of light. You will pay for waking me, and for finding Lily's doll. His voice hissed, cold as ice, carrying a deadly threat. Emily screamed in horror, trying to retreat, trying to escape from the cramped room. But he grabbed her arm, squeezing so hard that she felt like her bones were about to break. Darkness enveloped Emily, and she felt an extreme fear, a hopeless despair engulfing her. The man's savage, cackling laughter echoed in the secret room, mingling with Emily's painful, choked screams. The man's cold, rough hand tightened around Emily's arm, his nails digging into her flesh, causing a sharp, piercing pain. The shiny knife in his hand glinted in the weak flashlight, just a few centimeters from her face. "You won't get away," he hissed, his breath blowing into Emily's face, carrying a foul, fishy smell. Emily tried to struggle, but her strength was no match for his. She let out a scream of terror. The scream choked in her throat. At that critical moment, when the cold blade was about to touch Emily's flesh, a shrill voice rang out from behind the door leading to the secret room. "Let her go now." Mrs. Miller, the floor manager, stood frozen in the doorway, her face pale but her eyes shining with an unusual determination. She had just followed Emily upstairs because she felt something was wrong. And when she saw the door to room 216 slightly open, along with the flickering flashlight, her intuition told her that something was wrong. The man turned around in shock, his eyes flashing with anger. When he saw Mrs. Miller, "You damn old woman, get out," he growled, his voice full of menace. But he still did not let go of Emily. Mrs. Miller was not shaken. She held the flashlight in her hand and shined it straight into the man's face, making him squint in annoyance. "I've been working here for years, and I know what happens in this hotel." Mrs. Miller's voice was trembling but still firm. "Who are you? Why are you here and hurting this girl?" The man sneered. "What does it have to do with you? This is my private matter with this girl." With that, he squeezed Emily's hand tighter, causing her to cry out in pain. Mrs. Miller saw Emily's pale face, and the blood dripping from the wound on her shoulder. Her heart filled with pity and anger. Without hesitation, Mrs. Miller rushed towards the man. The flashlight in her hand swung up, hitting him hard on the head. A thump sound rang out. The man groaned in pain, letting go of Emily's hand. Emily quickly retreated, clutching her bleeding shoulder. The man clutched his head, staggering back, his eyes filled with hatred as he looked at Mrs. Miller. You will regret it," he gritted his teeth and said. Then he turned around, intending to run deeper into the secret room. But at that moment, a loud noise rang out, as if something very large had just fallen. The man stopped, turning his head to look towards the direction of the noise. In the darkness, Emily and Mrs. Miller saw the blurry figure of a little girl standing in the corner of the room, her eyes burning with hatred, staring at the man. The man seemed to freeze in place, his mouth agape, unable to speak, his eyes filled with horror as he saw Lily's figure. Taking advantage of that opportunity, Mrs. Miller quickly pulled Emily out of the secret room. "Let's go, quickly," she whispered, her voice filled with worry. Emily, still dizzy and in pain, still tried to run after Mrs. Miller. They hurriedly crawled through the small door leading to the hallway of room 216. Once they got there, Mrs. Miller quickly slammed the door shut and used a nearby wooden chair to block the door. "We have to get out of here immediately," Mrs. Miller said, her voice urgent. "He's dangerous." Emily nodded, tears still streaming down her pale face. She felt extremely grateful for Mrs. Miller's courage and quick thinking. The two women hurried out of room 216, quickly heading towards the elevator. As they reached the hallway, they heard the door to the secret room being violently broken open. The man had escaped and was chasing them. "Hurry! He's chasing you!" Mrs. Miller shouted, pulling Emily faster. They rushed down the stairs, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the silence of the hotel. As they passed the third floor, Emily suddenly saw the blurry figure of Lily standing at the end of the hallway, her hand raised as if to block the way of the man chasing them. The man seemed to stumble on something invisible. He staggered and almost fell, giving Emily and Mrs. Miller some time to escape. Finally, Emily and Mrs. Miller reached the lobby. Mrs. Miller shouted for the security. The man chased them down the hall. He still held the knife in his hand, his eyes filled with madness. But before he could do anything, 2 hotel security guards rushed in, restrained him, and took the knife from his hand. He screamed and cursed, but was tied up and taken out. Emily and Mrs. Miller sat down on the couch, panting, still in shock. Mrs. Miller hugged Emily, patting her on the back. "It's okay, baby. It's over." But Emily knew that, even though the murderer had been caught, the horrible memories of tonight would haunt her forever. And she could never forget the extraordinary courage of Mrs. Miller, who had fearlessly faced danger to save her. After the man was subdued and taken out, the reception hall became chaotic with police sirens and excited chatter. Emily and Mrs. Miller sat on the old sofa, breathing heavily, their bodies still shaking with fear. The wound on Emily's shoulder ached, blood still seeping through her clothes. The police quickly arrived, sealed off the scene, and began taking statements. Emily recounted everything she had experienced, from the strange phenomena in room 412, to finding Clara's diary, to discovering the secret room and the terrifying encounter with the man. Mrs. Miller also confirmed what Emily said. She told of her uneasy feeling and how she followed Emily to the room. "I don't understand why there is such a secret room in this hotel," Mrs. Miller said in a voice full of wonder and worry. "I've worked here for over 20 years, but I've never heard of it." When police searched room 216 and the secret room, they found a small skeleton identified as Lily Blackwood, along with a blood-stained doll and the knife the man used to attack Emily. Clara's diary was also collected as evidence. The man arrested claimed to be Arthur Davies, the grandson of a former manager of the hotel in the 1950s. He had been haunted by stories about Lily, and believed that her spirit held a secret treasure in the hotel. He murdered Lily and hid her body in the secret room, then returned to the hotel to search for the treasure. He also confessed to causing the hotel's ghostly phenomena to scare away others, and that he had followed Emily because he suspected she knew something. Police were skeptical of his testimony, but the evidence collected did shed some light on the dark mysteries of the St. Clair. After working with the police, Emily felt exhausted, both physically and mentally. Mrs. Miller suggested that Emily stay at the hotel for another night to rest. But Emily did not want to return to room 216. Mrs. Miller arranged for Emily to have another room downstairs, a warmer and quieter room. Even though she was safe, Emily could not forget the image of little Lily and the pain and resentment she had experienced. Emily felt a strong urge to help Lily find peace. "Mrs. Miller," Emily said, her voice soft, "I feel like I need to do something for Lily. She has suffered too much." Mrs. Miller nodded, her eyes shining with sympathy. "I understand, little Emily. Lily's soul has been trapped here for too long." Mrs. Miller told Emily more about the hotel's ghostly stories, about guests who had seen a sad woman wandering the hallways, and strange footsteps in the dead of night. The next morning, Emily decided to return to room 216 with Mrs. Miller. She brought the rag doll that Lily had given her. As she entered the room, Emily felt a chill in the air. The little girl's figure appeared in the corner of the room again, her eyes still filled with tears. Emily gently placed the doll on the floor, near where the little girl usually sat. "Lily, I know what happened to you," Emily said, her voice gentle. "The person who hurt you has been caught. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Lily's figure still stood there, unresponsive. Mrs. Miller walked over to Emily and said softly, "Maybe she wants us to do something else. She's been locked up here for so long." The resentment must have been deeply ingrained in her soul. Emily looked around the room, recalling the painful images she saw when she touched the doll. She suddenly understood. Lily not only wanted the murderer to be punished, but she also wanted to find back the beautiful memories she had lost. Emily and Mrs. Miller began to search the room, hoping to find something that could help Lily recall happy memories. They found an old music box under the bed, and when they opened it, a melodious, sad melody played. Lily's face seemed to relax a little when she heard the music. Then Emily found an old photo of a little girl smiling brightly, hugging the rag doll that Emily was holding. It was Lily. When Emily showed the photo to Lily, the little girl's eyes lit up. A small smile appeared on her lips. Lily's silhouette gradually became more transparent, and she slowly approached Emily, reaching out to gently touch her cheek. Emily felt a gentle, warm touch, no longer cold like before. A clear voice rang out in Emily's head. "Thank you." Then Lily's silhouette disappeared into the air, leaving a strange sense of peace in the room. After Lily was at peace, the strange phenomena in the St. Clair Hotel seemed to stop. Guests and staff no longer heard her crying, nor did they see her figure. Emily left San Francisco, carrying with her unforgettable memories of her days at the St. Clair Hotel. She knew that she had experienced something very scary, but at the same time very meaningful. She had helped a lost soul find freedom. As for the St. Clair Hotel, it continued to welcome guests, but there were no more rumors of its haunting. However, sometimes, on quiet nights, those in room 216 could still feel a gentle breeze, and hear a melodious, sad melody echoing from somewhere, like a silent thank you from a soul that had been put to rest. Thank you for listening to today's story. If you want to challenge your nerves further, subscribe to the channel to continue discovering other horror mysteries.